The main aim of stealth camping is to remain hidden from people. One of the first tasks you'll need to do is set up a shelter, and for this to be effective, you'll need to apply a number of techniques to make sure your shelter blends in as much as possible with the environment around you. There might be a time where you find yourself out in the wild with absolutely no tools whatsoever. But if you take a few seconds to observe your environment, you can actually build a well-hidden shelter using the natural materials around you. This type of stealth shelter is often the best, as it involves material that was already there in the woods, which makes it look more natural and less catching to the eye. If time is short, look for a fallen tree, log, or small bush. That way, you already have half the material for your shelter already there. Then snap some sticks and small logs and start to lean them up against the fallen tree. You don't really want this shelter to be higher than waist height, as this is generally the height of most low-growing vegetation, and it ensures your shelter has a low profile. Start with the largest sticks at the front entrance of your shelter, and then work your way down using smaller sticks each time. Don't be afraid to rest other sticks on top of the ones you have put there. They should be well supported from the bottom sticks. The more sticks you use, the less debris material is needed to cover the shelter. Next, grab some leaves, dead grass or other small branches with leaves on, and start to put these at the bottom of your shelter. Keep layering up the leaves as you go, and if you pick up a small handful of twigs as you do this, it will help to trap leaves against the sticks and stop them falling through. The thicker you make the layer of leaves, the more waterproof your shelter will be. Now you have yourself a low-profile stealth shelter, which can be made in as little as 20 minutes. Yes, that's right, 20 minutes. And if you don't believe me, there's a link to a 20-minute live shelter build that I did a few years ago, with no edit cuts, just real-time building. I'll link it in the description below. The great thing about this shelter is that it blends in well with the environment, and it's dead easy to dismantle. Just lift up the sticks, scatter them about the woods, flatten out the leaves, and leave no trace. Here is a shot of the area before the shelter was built, and here is a shot after. Of course, it will look slightly different, but it's low impact and easy to build with no tools. Fallen trees can come in very useful when looking for shelter. Here is a small Scots pine tree that was blown over in a storm. Using just minimal tools, such as a folding saw and a hatchet, I put 4 stakes into the ground, and built a sidewall using some dead logs. Then, at the other side of the tree root, I did the same. Now I had a shelter that was protected from the back and 2 sides. All that was needed was to make a roof. Before I did that, I trimmed off any protruding tree roots. Even though the tree has been dead a long time, all of the resin builds up in the tree roots, and this is often the last place that you can still find resin on a dead tree. You can make shavings of the resinous orangey red area of the root, and you can light a fire using these fine shavings. It's pretty flammable and will burn for a while. For the roof, I just placed a number of horizontal logs that rested on the logs of the sidewalls. All that's left now is to get some thatching material. A quick glance around the area shows that there is plenty of dead bracken. It's nearby and it's easy to collect by just snapping it off at the stem. It's a fast growing plant and will grow back again the following summer. Similar to the debris leaf shelter, it's just a case of piling up the bracken to create a thick layer. This not only helps to keep water from dripping on you, but it also helps to insulate the shelter. As there is a natural hollow that has been left by the root system as the tree fell down, it's important to be raised up off the ground. So I made some stakes and built a small raised bed. Underneath that bed, I put a mylar blanket which reflects the heat back to my body. As I built this shelter many years ago, I would recommend keeping the mylar blanket as close to your body as possible, preferably on top of the sleeping pad. And here's the finished shelter. More time consuming to build than the previous one, but well protected from all sides and blending in well with the environment. It's also easy to dismantle when you pack up camp. Sticking with the theme of fallen trees, some trees don't fall all the way to the ground. They get hung up in the branches and other trees. Providing they are sturdy enough, they can make a good quick shelter. However, it's really important that you check that these trees are well hung up and sturdy before deciding to build any form of shelter around them. Again, using no tools, I just snap off a load of sticks and lean these up against the fallen tree trunk. For the larger diameter logs, I just find 2 trees that are growing closely together and use these as a pivot to pinch and snap the logs. With the skeleton frame of the shelter built, this time there is no bracken around me, but there is an abundance of moss, and so by gently rolling the moss, I'm able to pick up large chunks, which will make it easier to cover the shelter, and it means less journeys carrying the moss back and forth. This type of moss does not have a root system, it spreads by rhizomes, and so it's important not to pull up an entire area of moss, as it can be detrimental to the regrowth. So I'm always careful to move on to another patch of moss, rather than take it all from one area. And with that, the shelter is complete, with an insulated moss roof and a large enough area inside to comfortably sleep and stay dry. But what if you don't have a fallen tree or log to build a shelter against? In this case, you will need to make a basic A-frame. You can do this by finding two forked sticks and interlocking them with each other to create the A-frame shape. Then use a longer log to slot into these interlocking forked sticks. This acts as a centre ridgepole and will allow your structure to stand freely on its own. Then cut off a forked branch and put a point on the end of it. Hit this into the ground to secure your ridgepole in place and stop it from rolling to the side. Then, as with the previous shelters, lean up the sticks against the ridgepole and add in some moss as the insulation layer. You can see from looking at the rear of the shelter that it really blends in well with the backdrop of the woodland. Again, it's wide enough to be comfortable in and low enough to have headroom but still be low profile. I mentioned earlier about building a shelter with no tools in 20 minutes. Well, that shelter was a simple A-frame, built in a similar fashion to the previous moss roof A-frame that I built with no tools. You might have noticed in that video that all of the sticks were very straight in the way that they grow, and that's because the trees were growing incredibly close together, which means that they grow upwards fast, trying to chase each other for the sunlight. In this particular shelter, however, the wood is not as straight, but the concept is the same. Lean them up against the fallen tree and use the debris around you for cover. This time it was a deciduous forest, which means the trees drop their leaves every autumn, so for cover material it made sense to use leaves. If you don't want to make a stealth shelter from natural materials, there is always the option of using man-made materials, which will generally be more waterproof. A couple of bin bags or trash bags can serve you well when looking to make a shelter. If you cut along the base of the bags and open them up, you can maximise the amount of space that these bags can cover. In this example, I build a simple frame by burying hooped sticks in the ground. The ground here was quite hard, so I hammered in a sharpened stick to make a pilot hole for the larger frame pole to go in the ground. These sticks are green, which means they were cut as fresh saplings. Now I can bend the stick right over without it snapping. Place these sticks in the holes on the opposite side. Then lash some horizontal sticks to the hooped sticks at regular intervals across the frame. Now spread the bin bags over the frame and tie them on. If you cut a hole in the bin bag for your cordage, it will generally stretch and tear easily when put under pressure. Instead, you can use a pine cone or a small stone and wrap the material around this. Then tie a sliding loop knot to secure it in place. Now you can lash this to the frame without it stretching the material and damaging it. Then I just place more cut bags overlapping the previous ones like tiles. Now, although the shelter is pretty low profile, it's still fairly visible. So, using some short vegetation like this rhododendron bush, I can place it in the ground, around the shelter and on top of the shelter to help it to blend in more with the natural environment. Bin bags are cheap, and whilst they make a good short-term shelter, over time they will wear and rip, and that's where a more durable tarp comes in. Many tarps these days have multiple tie-out points, and this means that you can make a wide range of different shelters from them. For stealth camping with a tarp, I always opt for low-profile setups. By low profile, I mean I generally set them up no higher than my waist. Sure, you can't stand up in them, but they are much harder to see from the distance because of most low-growing shrubs and vegetation, which will cover the line of sight. For the next few shelters, I tie a ridgeline at waist height. I then use the rest of the tie-up points to create different styles of shelter. The first of those is what I call the sea-fly. This style of shelter works better with a smaller tarp, but it's still achievable even with this 3x3 meter one. I fold the tarp over the ridgeline, and then peg down the first tie-up points below this ridgeline. Head round to the front of the tarp, fold it over on itself and tie it back off at the ridgeline. You can probably spot that I folded this the wrong way, which means that it could collect water. So just fold it under itself instead of over. That way the rain won't collect in the folds of the tarp. Then grab 2 sticks and peg out the remaining 2 tie-up points to the ground. With the remaining loose tarp material, tuck it underneath to act as a ground sheet. This type of shelter is called the C-fly because from a certain angle it looks like the letter C. If the weather turns bad on you and you have strong winds, heavy rain, and you need to weather a storm, then you can lower the front of the roof of the shelter to allow greater runoff for rain and to protect you from strong winds. To lower it, just loosen off the guy lines and slide the tie-up points of the tarp down the 2 sticks. Then repeg the guy lines out once you are pleased with the right height. This is known as the C-fly wedge, as it forms more of a wedge shape. With just a few small adaptations, you can turn this shelter into what I call the body bag. To make this shelter, just take out the vertical support sticks and peg out each loose corner of the tarp. Tuck the remaining parts of the tarp underneath the shelter to form your ground sheet. Now you've made a mini A-frame shelter with a ground sheet. Now you can probably guess why it's called the body bag. Space is not a premium in this one, but it is one of the best stealth tarp shelters to have in a storm, as you are protected from almost all sides. The next shelter is one that I have used a lot over the years, and you will have seen me do on a number of different camping trips if you are a long-term subscriber. I just call it the stealth shelter. To build this shelter, I just tie the 3 centre tie-up points at one end of the tarp to be nearest the ridgeline. Then peg out the 2 remaining corners at an angle. Then head to the rear of the shelter and tuck half of the tarp underneath itself. This is going to act as your ground sheet to sleep on. Find the next 3 tie-up points that are opposite the ones you secured on the ridgeline and peg these down. If you see any remaining tie-up points, peg these down too. Keep the tarp material as tight as possible. Go back around the front of the shelter and pull out the remaining loose tarp to form your ground sheet. This type of shelter allows you to see out into the woodland whilst also staying fully protected from all other angles. If space is something you want to prioritise but you don't want to sacrifice the stealth element too much, then you can further adapt this shelter to create more space, yet still keep the same low profile. Rather than tuck the loose tarp underneath to form your ground sheet, you can actually raise it up using 2 sticks. This forms a ground bivvy tent. Do the same to both sides of the back of the shelter. Make sure there is a slight downward slope from your ridgeline so that water can be shed when it rains. If you have a 3x3 metre tarp like this, then you will still have some spare material to use as a ground sheet. The benefit of this style of shelter is that you have more space behind you to store your gear. If you're the type of person that doesn't get on with tarps and you want a simple, fast setup with no hassle, then look into using a bivvy bag. A bivvy bag is essentially like a waterproof cover that you put your sleeping bag and sleeping mat inside of and just sleep under the stars. It's not really a shelter as such, as although your body is protected from the rain and cold, your head is still fairly exposed. Great for sleeping under the stars on the warmer nights, but not so good when the weather turns. And so my go-to bivvy for stealth camping is this. It's essentially a tent with 2 additional small tent poles which act as a mini tent. It's still a similar size to a bivvy bag, but you have the added benefit of being protected from the elements. You do, however, get condensation build-up. So be aware that the inside will get this, especially in colder weather. However, it still has a very low profile. You can bury it in hedges and dense bushes for extra cover, or you can cover it in a piece of camouflage netting to make it blend in more with the environment around it. It also packs down really small, much smaller than most tents. All round, it's not a bad piece of kit to have, especially if you need to bail quickly from your night in the woods. And that's just a few stealth shelters that you can make. Some using natural materials, and some using man-made materials. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe, and be sure to check out my other stealth camping and wilderness survival tips playlist in the video description below. Also, don't forget to check out our other YouTube channel, TA Fishing, and if you are interested in the particular tarp and bivvy tent that I used in this video, I will put links to it in the description below. Cheers for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.